Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, oh, there it goes. All right. No, I'll just do that. Well, thank you all for inviting me. Thanks, Nancy, for the wonderful engagement, and Abuna and Sherry. As we mentioned, I've known Abuna and Sherry for a really, really long time. Abuna when he was young, and Sherry when she was doing her bachelor's and master's at Michigan. I am intimidated because I'm not very qualified to talk on this topic. I have been married 25 years. My wife and I fought this morning, so there's that. So I think we're all in this together. So I thought the topic should be fighting and forgiving, and just for fun, every once in a while, I'll be fighting with my wife. And she'll say something like, "Oh, is that what you say in your talks? Is that what you tell people to do in your talks too? Be a jerk?" And I'm like, "Hey, those are the talks, okay? This is the real me." All right. So anyway, fighting and forgiving, and I think I'm as they mentioned, I'm an accountant, so I'm not a therapist. I don't have a psychological background, so I'm not going to approach things from that perspective. I'm not, here are tips for a successful marriage and how to communicate and, the stuff that therapists do really well. I'm not going to have that perspective very much. I think my perspective is a little bit more of just of a spiritual perspective. And the reason I think that is because I kind of view marriage as a very spiritual activity. And it really is a very spiritual activity, and I don't. Do you hear it too? Oh, it's her. Okay, it's a little girl. It was a long flight, but it wasn't that long. All right. Maybe I caught COVID on the plane. Maybe I caught something else. I don't know. All right. What was I saying? So anyway, marriage is a spiritual activity, and I think of it to get through it, you have to kind of get through it spiritually. And you guys all know the statistics. A lot of people get divorced. It's very hard. You've all, I can see different levels, ages of people being married. It was kind of fun seeing you guys interact with your kids outside. It reminded me of interacting with my kids. My kids are now older, and so anyway, we'll just kind of go. So fighting and forgiving. This sculpture, by the way, was something called a Burning Man. Has anyone heard of Burning Man? It's just full of drugs, right? You shouldn't never go to this thing, right? But this sculpture, it's like a concert where everyone's just stoned the whole time. But it shows two adults with their backs to each other because they're fighting, obviously. But the inner child inside them wants to connect. And I think a lot of our fighting is like this, right? You're mad at your spouse, you give them your back, you're pissed off, but there's something inside of you like, I wish they would reach out to me, and they wish you would reach out to them. And there's a part of you that's hoping to connect, even though your backs to each other and you hate each other, just for a moment, or longer. So we'll kind of go through all of this. I was asked by Nancy Abuna, I'm not sure why. And so many people, when they found out I was doing this, they offered me lots of material, which is code for, you don't know what you're talking about, right? I'm like, no, I don't. Here's my qualifications. I'm an accountant. I have a PhD in accounting. I don't have a degree in child psychology. I don't have a degree in marriage therapy or psychology or sociology or child behavior. I don't have grandkids or even a good track record with my own kids. So I'm really not sure why I'm here, other than maybe tell some jokes, get some free food. So here's some tips on how to fight fair, and I thought I'd kind of start with the more of the practical kind of psychology side of things. First thing is pray. Don't mirror unfair fighting. Your spouse inevitably will fight unfairly. Don't do that. Don't do it back to them. And of course, when you do it, you'll say, well, you did this, and so I'm going to do this. Don't go there. Give fair warning. Be a great listener. Seek to understand. We're going to kind of flesh all of these out a little bit later over the weekend. But seeking to understand is huge because our initial reaction is, he's an idiot. And it's usually he's an idiot. And he's an idiot, and I have to explain him why he's an idiot. Or she doesn't get it, she's emotional, it's the time of the month, whatever excuse the guy comes up with. And they're not really seeking to understand, right? And that's a big thing. Stay on topic, very hard to do. I mean, we've all had this, right? We have these fights that go on for like 7 hours into the night, right? And then at the end, you're like, what were we fighting about? You've had like 9 fights along the way, and you can't remember the original. That's always nice. Stop comparing. Your voice is hoarse. You're like, can we just sleep? Right. Avoid making assumptions. This is huge. We all do this about the other person, about their intent. You're saying this because you hate my mom, right? And person's like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? And it's like, oh no, it's because last month this happened, and now you're doing, and you're like, what? Don't insult. No insults or yelling. That doesn't happen. Don't bring up the past. That doesn't happen either. Be respectful. Take breaks. Always a good thing, especially when you're hot. When something happens and you're hot, just put a pin in it, and it's always a good idea. Just let's wait. I don't want to talk about this right now. Can we talk about it later? Right? And that's always a good idea. Give it a night. Some people give the opposite advice, which is don't go to bed angry. That doesn't always work. Sometimes you do go to bed angry, but sometimes you cool off, right? And then you can work through it. Agree to disagree agreeably. Look to your spouse's interests. Remember, you're on the same team. And of course, the OCD in me saw this number 15 and just couldn't deal with the fact that they spelled it wrong. And I was like, there's no way they just did that. Yeah, so you are on the same team, not you are. Anyway, muhim. Okay. So forgiving each other. How can someone forgive and forget? And this starting all things anew. And this idea of starting anew is an extremely important one in marriage, as you all know, because no matter how much you fight and no matter how much you have a great time, every day you have to wake up with the same person, right? And so your choices are, either you kill them, right? Or you leave them, right? Or you just stay pissed off at each other, or you figure it out, right? And marriage has a lot of that, just figure it out. And there's a lot of stuff you have to figure out with your own spouse that's unique to your spouse. So you talk to one of your friends and you say, well, my wife does this, 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 and he'll say, my wife never does that. But my wife does this, this, and this, right? Or she would handle it very differently, or he would handle it very differently. One thing that God creates in us is the ability to forgive. And we'll talk more about this. But this is not something natural, and it's not really something human. It's something that's divine, right? And the reason I think marriage is a spiritual endeavor and can only be functioning as a spiritual endeavor is because that part of it only can come from God. Loving someone unconditionally is a God thing. It's not really a human thing. Okay? And you hear these statistics on divorce, like in LA, 75% of people are divorced, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. To be honest, I can, and sometimes I wonder how 25% of the people stay married. Because, if you think about marriage, right, it's very hard to stay married, right? Outside of a spiritual context, outside of being Christ-centered, outside of doing something for God, if it's just the other person, you get married, yeah, it's exciting, we hold hands, blah, blah, blah. 5 years into it, all right, I'm done, right? I can move on. All the excitement's gone, okay? And so as a secular society, why more people don't get divorced kind of surprises me, right? I would think after a few years, you're bored of the other person, they piss you off, time to move on to someone else, right? So it's hard to imagine marriage outside of that. In fact, when people come to me and they're, secular, atheist, whatever, and they say, do you have any marriage tips? I actually have a lot of difficulty giving atheist couples marriage tips. I don't know how to help you. I can't even think of why you would stay together, right? You hate him, she hates you. Move on, right? There's really no reason to outside of religion. Sometimes I say things I shouldn't say, so you just have to be careful. I say things I think that most people keep inside. And so, of course, we say this in the Lord's Prayer, right? Forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, right? But of course, we don't mean it, right? And we say it all the time, and we never mean it. Because if we think about that statement is gigantic. And it means that I will never not forgive anyone, right? Every single time. And so sometimes the church gives us these repetitions, and we just sort of repeat them and move on. But when it's real, when he's pissing me off or she's pissing me off, that doesn't come out of my mouth very easily, right? Forgiving the other person or succumbing or being humble or admitting or being the first person to say, hey, let's work it out, right? That's seen as a sign of weakness. And it's like, no, I'm not going to give him the pleasure. I'm not going to give her the pleasure of being the first one. I always go back first, right? She never comes back first. He never comes back first, right? That's just ego, right? And again, ego is a spiritual problem, right? What was the one sin that Satan fell from? Pride, right? So all the sins on earth are the same sin. Pride, the ego, the self, right? It's all the same sin. Every sin in the world is the same sin, right? And it's all based in that one thing. And so, like I said, this is a very spiritual endeavor, forgiving one another. I have lots of quotes. I like to plagiarize. Each person must bear the weakness of others. Who is perfect? Who can boast that he has kept his heart undefiled? Hence, we are all sick. And whoever condemns his brother does not perceive that he himself is sick, because a sick person does not condemn another sick person. Do you see that last part? That's huge, right? Abuna B'Shor Kamil, like the saint Abuna B'Shor Kamil, used to have this saying, and I remember hearing it when I was in college and not understanding it all. He'd say, if anyone judges the other person, then he doesn't see himself as a sinner. And I was 24, and I'm like, I can judge people all the time, and I can tell that they're sinners, and that doesn't mean I don't see myself as a sinner. But that's what that means, right? Because if you see yourself as sick, then you can't go after someone else. If you see yourself as broken, then when your wife or your husband does something, you can't go after them, because you're like, well, I'm broken too. And really the crux of the problem, and as you'll see in the talks as we go on, the crux of the problem is I don't see me the way I should see me. And the reason I don't see everyone else the way I should see everyone else is because I don't see me the way I should see me. And that's really the problem. It's a spiritual problem, right? And so he says, whoever condemns his brother does not perceive that he himself is sick. And I can take out brother and put spouse. So as soon as we start condemning our spouse, and he's this, and he's very prideful, and she's very arrogant, she's boastful, and she's into her image, and he's into his looks, and what's happening? I don't see my own sickness. I see someone else's sickness, right? And I always think of this, right? Imagine, you walk into a hospital, right? And you start walking through the hospital, and you walk into someone's room, and you say, hey, what do you have? And he says, I have COVID. And you're like, oh, you're disgusting. And when you go in another room, hey, what do you have? And he says, I have cancer. Oh, that's gross. And what do you have? I have a pancreas that doesn't work. That's terrible. Imagine you going from room to room attacking people. What's going to happen? Nurse is going to walk up to you, sir, can I help you? And you're going to say, no. She's like, are you sick? Do you have a problem? No. I just want to attack people. And she's going to say, why don't you leave? We don't need you here attacking people. Now, but if I walk into the hospital and I've got cancer, then I'm very focused on my cancer, right? I'm not going to leave the cancer floor and go down to the, the heart floor, right? The cardiac arrest floor, and then start attacking people who have heart attacks and say, you guys must have eaten a lot of steak, right? It's like, you got cancer, bro. Why don't you go up to get your chemo and focus on yourself, right? And the only time we start focusing on others is when I'm not focusing on myself, right? And that becomes the problem. That's him. He's so cute, right? Like, how could you not love this guy? So cute. Okay, so why is it hard to forgive? There's lots of reasons. First, someone is harsh and hurts you. So cruelty, meanness, harshness, and real consequences, they make it very hard to forgive someone when someone is mean and purposeful. And imagine someone gets put in jail over for 10 years over a lie. Someone lies about you, and then you go to jail for 10 years. Now it's a real consequence. Now something happened to you, or someone did something, and a hand got cut off because someone did something illegal. That's real, right? And what were Joseph's feelings when he got thrown into a pit? Right? He went to a pit, he went into prison. Why? Because his brothers were jealous. And now he's like, I'm now in a pit. I just got sold to slaves. I just got put in jail. All because my brothers did this. How do I forgive my brothers? Because it's one thing when someone says something about you and you're like, yeah, you're an idiot. But when someone does something and now you're in jail because of it, it's real. And in the middle of that story, can you even imagine telling Joseph to forgive? Imagine he's in jail and go, you really should forgive your brothers. I imagine Joseph would look at you and go, really? Is that what you would do? Why is it hard to forgive? Mistakes repeat themselves. This is the beauty of marriage. When someone continues to sin against you over and over and over again and does the same thing, right? And this is really the source of our frustration, right? This idea of the straw that broke the camel's back. This happens a lot, right? When your husband forgets for the 80th time to take out the trash, right? And it's a little thing, and all of a sudden you lose your mind, right? And he's like, why are you losing your mind? I just forgot. But it's number 80, right? Or they don't realize, they don't notice, they don't care. This is mostly for the men. And just continue to hurt you, right? Without any sensitivity towards your feelings. They just keep doing the same thing. You mention it a few times, but they just keep doing it. And now how am I supposed to forgive him? He doesn't even notice that he's doing it. He doesn't care. And I've brought it up to him before. This makes it very, very hard. Again, a permanent injury. You lose a finger, a hand, an eye, money. Many people have been cheated out of money by someone who stole something from them. That's hard, right? And some of you have been in that situation. It's hard to forgive when there's a real cost. And every time you see that injury, it reminds you that wouldn't have happened if he hadn't done that. Why is it else hard to forgive? People don't admit their mistakes. I mean, I do. I'm an archdeacon, but the rest of you don't. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing for you to, I kid sometimes, but I don't smile. It's one thing to admit, people just look at me, is he serious? One time I was telling the youth, I said, I'm an archdeacon, I'm right above the cherubim, just right. And I said it with a straight face, and they all looked at me like, what's wrong with this guy? So it's one thing when someone asks for forgiveness. Someone messes up, I'm saying, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. You're like, okay, fine, don't do it again, right? But when someone doesn't admit it and says, no, I don't care, now you're pissed, right? Now you're like, at least admit you messed up. And they're like, no. And they argue and they fight and they don't stop. And we don't see repentance with our own eyes. We don't see God's intervention. Sometimes they're successful. Someone burns you, and then they all go on to make a lot of money, or they go on to do very well, or their kids are doing great, right? And I know how they really are, but their kid got into Stanford. That burns us a little bit. So even David in the Psalm says, do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it only leads to evil. So sometimes even seeing someone succeed kind of gets us a little bit, especially if that person has wronged us, right? And you feel it too when your spouse messes up, and then it works, right? This happens all the time. My husband doesn't listen to his wife. He says, I'm just going to do whatever I want. She's like, okay, we'll see what happens, right? And then it works. And then she gets really pissed, right? She kind of wished it hadn't worked. And of course, he'll never admit he was wrong at that point. And why else is it hard to forgive if it's someone you love? This hurts the most. And this is why we're all here, right? Because anyone can hurt you, a work, friend, servant, abuna, whatever. But when your wife or your husband hurts you, it really hurts. Because when you expect love, and the knife comes from someone you love, then it stings. And this is where Christ can look at us and says, I know, right? Judas did it to me. And in fact, when Judas went to betray him, what did Christ say? Beloved, you're gonna give me away with a kiss. And he kissed him. Imagine that one. Imagine someone kissing you on the cheek right before they sell you to execution. And they have the nerve to kiss you on a cheek. Right? That stings. And so Christ took almost the worst kind of stab in the back. And in fact, what did Jesus do the day before? He washed his feet. He washed his feet and then he betrayed him. That sucks. And so when it comes from the person you love or the person you trust, when someone cuts you off on the freeway, then flips you off, you're like, yeah, whatever. He's got a mental problem. Right? That's easy. But when it comes from your wife or your husband, it's far more painful. And then it makes it even harder to forgive because she should know better, he should know better than to do that to me. And they know it hurts me. And every once in a while, God forgive us all, we know our spouse's buttons and we say them. Your mom used to do the same thing. Oba, right? And you know that's a button, but you just wanted to push it anyway because you were mad and you wanted to make the point. And now she's looking at you like, that hurt me. And yet you said it. And you meant it. How am I going to forgive you? Tough stuff. C.S. Lewis says, to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable in others because Christ has forgiven the inexcusable in us. I love C.S. Lewis. The key words, inexcusable. There is no excuse. So sometimes somebody will call the therapist or Abuna or whoever and say, can you believe he did this or she did this? That's inexcusable. And the right answer isn't always, well, maybe they didn't know, maybe they weren't, blah, blah, blah. Maybe, you took your two. It was inexcusable. Correct. It was. And now once we get that out of the way, we can move forward. Now what? It was inexcusable. And Christ excused the inexcusable in me. So now what's C.S. Lewis saying here? He's putting two people together. Who? Me and Christ. Aren't you the image and likeness of Christ? Aren't you the image and likeness of God? Right? So once you start to reflect that image and likeness, you're going to forgive the inexcusable, just like Christ did. And I want to point something else out. I may say it later on. It isn't about thinking, what would Jesus do? Although I love that when they put the little bracelets on the kids. As an adult, it isn't about thinking, okay, I need to forgive them, okay, I must forgive them, right? Because once you're saying that, you aren't really forgiving, right? It's like when someone says, I need to be humble, I need to be humble, I need to be humble. Well, you ain't humble, right? If you have to say that to yourself, then you're not humble. It's not natural. You're trying to fake an outcome. You're trying to look like a Christian. You tub and you can do all the things you want, right? But that doesn't mean you're actually humble. If you have to tell yourself that, right? So when I have to push myself to forgive, well then I'm not really forgiving. So where is the push coming from? The push is to be the image and likeness of God in every way. And then what happens? Everything happens. I become humble. I forgive. I care about people. I don't mind when someone stabs me in the back. All of the things that naturally come, they just come as a consequence of being the image and likeness of God, naturally. I'll skip that. Sorry. So again, forgiving each other. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ, God, forgave you. So this is, C.S. Lewis is basically taking this from St. Paul in Ephesians. St. John Chrysostom says, there is nothing colder than a Christian who is not concerned about the salvation of others. Do not say, I cannot help others, for if you are truly a Christian, it is impossible not to. And so now St. John Chrysostom in this context is introducing another concept. As a couple, their salvation, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, is tied to each other. Her salvation and your salvation are now tied to each other. This isn't about being happy. Marriage isn't about being happy. Sorry. It's about being holy. And it's a big difference. And unfortunately, the world teaches us it's about being happy. About, whatever, riding off into the sunset and taking walks on the beach. You guys don't have beaches here, but if you did, they're beautiful, right? I'm just teasing you a little, right? So it is, I should stay focused. I am not. It's about holiness. It's about salvation. It's about caring about the other person's salvation. So when someone approaches me, even my spouse, I don't see them as the person that does whatever. I see them as someone who I am responsible for their salvation and they're responsible for mine, as is every Christian the same way. So what are the consequences of not forgiving? And this is a scary list. The first one is anxiety, interestingly enough. When we don't forgive, we have an anxiety. In fact, one of the common problems of today's age, there's more antidepressants being prescribed than anything else. Especially, you come to a place like Orange County, where I live. Everyone's rich. Everyone has plastic all over their bodies and faces. People have tons of money. I remember when I first moved to Southern California, my wife went to her primary care, a new primary care physician, and the doctor asked her, so what medications are you on? And my wife said, nothing. And she said, you're not on any antidepressant or anti-anxiety? And my wife was shocked at the question and said, no. She was, you don't take anything for anxiety? And my wife's like, no. She's like, oh, okay. That was the reaction. So in Orange County, where I live, half of the women are on anti-anxiety medication. It's a scary world. It's a very commonly prescribed medication. And there's a story I heard from Abu Nalo'a. It was an amazing story. This young man was confessing to him and telling him about how much he was, acting in a very abusive way. He was like sleeping around, drinking all the time, doing lots of drugs, and just destroying himself. And as he started probing more and more and more, he realized that his father had died 5 years earlier, and then he hated his dad. And that he never forgave his dad. And he died and he wouldn't even go to his dad's funeral. And the fact that he wouldn't forgive his dad, and now his dad was dead, so he couldn't forgive him face to face. He couldn't look him in the eye and say, Dad, I love you. And because of that, it was eating him up inside. So he started to destroy himself. He's literally beating himself up over it. He doesn't realize this is happening on a conscious level. But he's destroying himself as a way to get back at himself because he would not forgive his own father. So it's amazing that this lack of forgiveness was eating him up inside to the point of self-destructive behavior. And anxiety and lack of forgiveness is one of these things that gives Satan a foothold in our lives. Once I pick a person and I say, I'm not going to forgive them, right? And we do this, don't we? Right? You all have parents, right? And you ask, your mom, how come, Tante Susu doesn't come to the weddings? أصل Susu دي من 20 سنة أقول لك عملت إيه? Right? And, لبست نفس الفستان في الفرح وهي عارفة إن أنا جبت الفستان الأول, right? So one of these things, right? And it's almost like I'm talking from experience. And she will not forgive Susu, right? And it's 20 years later. I remember when I first started at USC, I started 10 years ago. I met with this professor. She's talking to me about this other professor, and she's telling me how much she hates this other professor and that he's an evil man and he's a jerk and he's this and this. And the veins in her forehead and her neck are flaring as she's telling me this story about what he did and how horrible of a person he is. And I was like, wow, oh my gosh. And she's telling me about what he did with some student and how he was so terrible. And I said, when did this happen? She said, 15 years ago. And I'm like, you're talking about it like it was yesterday. The veins and the blood pressure and everything. I mean, what's she doing? She's killing herself. And this woman now, unfortunately, has many, many medical problems, right? And her doctor keeps saying, less stress, less anxiety, more yoga. And now she does yoga. And the answer, in my opinion, is spiritual. You don't forgive. You're holding on, right? There's a beautiful quote by Buddha. He says, anger is a punishment I give to myself for the mistake of someone else. Anger is a punishment I give to myself for the mistake of someone else. And when you watch someone get very angry over the mistake of someone else, you see it, right? عمل كذا وكذا كذا كذا كذا, and they're all upset. And the person who did it has no idea this is happening. He doesn't care. He's living his best life. And you're just boiling. Consequence of not forgiving others, fear. When you don't forgive, fear enters our life. And like I said before, Satan has a stronghold in our life when I don't forgive. One of the weapons of Satan is fear. Every time we have fear, know that this is from the devil. Right? In fact, the one thing that Jesus repeated more than any other thing was what? Fear not. So every time I have fear, whether it be for my kids or my insurance or my retirement or my spouse or my health or my parent, that's from the devil. And that's what he uses. That's the weapon he uses against us. And so when I don't forgive and I allow Satan to live in me through that one way, fear starts to become something we see. And fear without reason, because you have given yourself over to the evil one. You may not forgive your parents, your siblings, your coworkers, your wife, and this will create fear. It will also create relationships that aren't very deep or passionate, either with God or with other people. Because when I hold something inside, when I keep something and I protect it, and I protect anger, and I protect resentment, and I protect the memory, this makes me block others, okay? And I talk to the youth a lot about this, right? So when someone, for example, gets cheated on, right? I have to warn the guy or the girl, and I say, look, you can't punish your next boyfriend or girlfriend for the sin of this one, right? Because for the rest of your life, you're going to have a trust issue now, right? The rest of your life, there's going to be a part of you that's protected. You're not going to open up, right? And so when I don't forgive my spouse, I start to protect around me. And I don't let them in because I don't want them to hurt me. And once I do that, I start to end the marriage relationship. The marriage relationship has to be completely open. And once I start to put layers around myself, then it's not that. And we cease to be one flesh and one body. Now it's him and her. I talk to her about these things, and I talk to him about these things, but I don't open up these other things, right? Because I haven't fully fleshed it out. I haven't forgiven. I haven't moved on. I'm holding something against you. Does that make sense? Consequence of not forgiving others, disliking yourself. When you don't forgive, you feel ugly. When you have a hatred in your heart, you feel ugly, right? And we've all felt the ugliness of sin. At our age, in our state of the marriage of our lives, when that we hold that thing, there's a not happy with myself feeling. You find that people hate themselves. Feeling of non-forgiveness and evil inside you makes you feel ugly and make you think that God doesn't love you either, or that people do not love me, because there is a darkness inside you that you yourself don't want to be there. One of the things we do is we project ourselves onto God. right? Every once in a while you'll hear someone say, you know, we'll talk about this maybe another time, but someone will say, ربنا هيولع في الناس دي, right? The Democrats, مثلا, ربنا هيولع فيهم, right? Or something like that. And you see this fist come out, right? And then you think to yourself, I don't know if God هيولع فيهم or you want to ولع فيهم. I think you do, okay? And I think you want to ولع فيهم and you're using God and you're projecting yourself onto God. God hates those people. Does he? I think you hate those people. I don't think God hates those people. Right? And I think you're letting your own emotions play out onto God himself. Okay? And so when I don't forgive and I resent and I hold back, whether it be my spouse or my friends or my boss or my coworker or the servant or Abuna or whoever, right? Part of me thinks about God in those terms. And part of me thinks other people don't forgive me as well. And I start to project my own darkness on others, right? And we see this all the time, right? When someone does something, someone, whatever, accomplishes anything, right? And we say, oh, well, you know why he's doing that, right? He's just doing that because he wants to be the center of attention. No, you like to be the center of attention. And so you think they want to be the center of attention because you like to be the center of attention. So you're projecting, right? This is a common thing in psychology. We can do this with God. We project our own lack of forgiveness, our own lack of love on God. Then when we go to repent, we're like, God will never forgive me. Why? Because I don't forgive others. That's the problem. Things to look out for. Denial. That's a volcano. You know what happens with volcanoes, right? Denial is not forgiveness. You're just simply repressing your memory when you want to just put something away. And it comes out again. You guys know you all know it comes out again, right? 6 months later, this reminds me of 6 months ago when you did blah, 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 right? And of course, the husbands are like, how come my wife remembers everything? And that's true. Okay. Now the husband is different. He doesn't remember things. It just builds. And then he blows up, right? And all of a sudden he's kicking the dog, kicking the cat, kicking the kids. You have no idea what just happened, right? He's just lost his mind, right? And he blows up like a volcano because he has so many of these anger things that you have done, or in his mind you have done to him, and he's mad. He may not even know why he's so mad. Right? He's mad at his boss, he loses it at work, he loses it wherever. Right? And so this is a defense mechanism, right? Instead of forgiving, we just repress. Let's not talk about it. Let's just agree to move on. Let's just not deal with this. That's not forgiveness. Right? That's repression. And all the psychologists will tell you it's not a good idea. But it's very common. So what do? We smile at each other, even though we can't stand each other. We do this at church all the time, right? See somebody, right? And I hate their guts, right? And they hate my guts, and we're all, right? Instead of clearing the air, even spouses can do this with each other. Let's just be civil. Let's just pretend, right? I shouldn't laugh. There's one couple that I'm talking with, and it's funny. He hates his wife, and every time we're together, he'll be like, "Yes, dear, it's lovely, honey, beautiful face, dimple nose, Misha, yadi," and you're just like, "What, yadi?" And if he could kill her, he would. Right? And so the two of us just look at each other. We just start laughing. Me and his wife, we're just laughing. I'm like, can you stop that, please? Just say what you think. Don't do the whole, why, she's so beautiful. Look at how lovely. Just stop, right? Okay. So this is very dangerous because there's no forgiveness. And even the church says you can't take communion in this state. Right? One of the few places the church says don't take communion is if you have a problem with your brother, don't go to the altar, leave the altar, go be reconciled with your brother first. right? So, and this is why even in the middle of the liturgy, we do this one strange ritual. Who remembers, right? The kiss of peace, right? Of course, I can't greet everyone in the church, but I'll greet everyone in a 360-degree circle before COVID, right? And I'll make peace with everyone around me, right? Because the church is saying you can't take communion in this state. It's that dangerous to take communion in that state. And then you may not realize you haven't forgotten, right? And then it comes out in the fight, right? A year later, 6 months later, 2 weeks later, all of a sudden, the stuff from the past comes up roaring. And you're bringing up old fights and old discussions, and this is when you did this, and she did this, and he did this. And like, whoa, what happened? I thought I forgave, but I hadn't forgiven. I had just repressed things. And this is the last point. You can see this when a very small infraction, the husband, whatever, leaves a dish in the sink, one dish, and the wife loses her mind. All right? And he says, "Kul da," over one dish, right? And obviously that's not the problem. The problem is it's number 1,000, right? And it means you don't care about what I said. And when we discussed this, you didn't do what as we had talked about, and, right? And so these things blow up and they build like a volcano. Okay. Forgiving makes us happy. So I got this out of a children's Sunday school lesson. And so what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to take this to the kids, and they're supposed to draw a face. And the moral of the story is forgiving makes us happy. And you're supposed to put a smiley face in there, and that's the activity for the day. The amount of truth and insight that this little cartoon has. My wife was doing a Sunday school lesson for like kindergarten. And they draw in the class. And this was the picture, the lesson for the day. And I looked at it, I go, that is so insightful. And I took a picture and I added it to the slides for the adults. Forgiving makes us happy. You actually feel better after you've forgiven, right? It's like that very first sculpture I put up with the two people with their backs, right? And we've all felt that, right? You have this anxiety and this, and it's been a day or 2 or 3 or a week, and I don't want to talk to her. And then you talk it out, and you forgive, and you hug, and it's like, why didn't we do this sooner? And this is exactly the same feeling, by the way, we have when we confess. We go to confession, right, and something's been eating away at us for months. And then we go to confession, and how do you feel after confession? You feel great. And then you all say the same thing. Why didn't I do that sooner? Why didn't I just confess sooner? Why didn't I get this off my chest sooner? Right? Confession makes us happy. Right? And this is, by the way, as a side note, why the church has the sacrament of confession. Sometimes we think of confession in a very negative way, like I have to list all the bad things I did so that God forgives them. If I forget one, then God's going to punish me, so I got to make sure I get all of them. It's not like that. Right? When you think about, have you ever heard of somebody who, well, I forget, when you have a kid, right, and a cookie is missing from the pantry, and you said, who took the cookie? Everyone looks down, right? And then finally, one kid goes, I took the cookie. And they come running, and they hug you, and they're crying. And I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And you say, well, why did you tell me? And they'll tell you, because it was eating me up inside, right? Keeping that from you was killing me. And then when I told you, I had a relief, right? And this is the way forgiveness makes us feel. Confession makes us feel. The act of forgiving and being forgiven makes us happier. And this is the state that God wants us in. God did not want us to be miserable. You're not supposed to be with your spouse to be miserable, right? But to learn about forgiveness and to learn how to be forgiven and how to forgive. Because when you do that, go back to the beginning of the talk, what do we become? The image and likeness of God. So God is trying to teach you who He is by you modeling that. He wants you to know how He feels by you feeling it. He wants you to know what Jesus felt being betrayed when you get betrayed. And then he wants you to know how Jesus felt when he forgave Judas on the spot. And he wants you to know that feeling. So then you understand love. Because until then, you don't. And love and marriage starts as a very, it can start sexually, it can start attraction. I can't think of anybody else, and I want to be with her or whatever. But it quickly moves and matures past that, and it becomes something much, much deeper. It's about this three-way union with God, and me understanding how God is by me forgiving and being forgiven. So how do we forgive? So what's the solution? How do we forgive? There's a story of a woman whose son was murdered by ISIS, and I remember watching this interview. Maybe some of you heard the interview. Abu Nadoud Lamai was giving a talk about this person that he met. And they asked her, how do you feel ISIS killed your son? What was her response? ISIS made me Shaheed. ISIS made me the mother of a martyr. I thank them. It's amazing. She didn't just forgive them. She went past that. In fact, when I was in Egypt 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to meet a mother of one of the 21 martyrs. And we sat with them for an hour and a half, and she was talking, I was translating to my kids. I couldn't finish the sentences she was saying without crying myself. I'm just translating. It's not my son. It's her son. And the way she's talking about what happened and who he was and how happy she is, I couldn't even finish the sentences. She had not just forgiven, she had moved on into love. She loved them. And she helped me realize that the real people who were in pain were not the 21 in the orange jumpsuits. It was the 21 behind them in the black with the knives. They were the ones who were in real pain. They're the ones we should feel sorry for and be upset for and hurt for, not the 21. So Christ said to Peter, he said, how many times should we forgive? Peter, as you know, he said 7. He thinks he's a bigwig. Peter always says stuff like that. It's 7 times. And Jesus said 7 times 70. And so what's the point what Jesus is saying? He's saying, 7 is the number of perfection, 10 is the number of perfection, 7 times 70, 7, perfection, perfection, perfection. So infinity. It's not 490. And so Peter is looking at the approach of this is an Old Testament kind of justification. How many times do I forgive before I'm justified? And some of you may ask the same thing. Some of you may come to Abuna and say, he's done this 9 times. How many times should I forgive before Adilu Begezma? Right? And Abuna says 3. No, I'm kidding. But so what Christ is trying to show them, is trying to show Peter and trying to show us, right? He's trying to show them a new approach, not the Old Testament approach of counting the number of times, because Peter said, how many times? Okay? But he's trying to say infinity. Okay? Now, why is Christ saying that to Peter? What's the point? Is he telling Peter, you should forgive infinite number of times? Is that the point? Is he telling him what to do? Or is he saying, this is who I am? So maybe he's trying to reveal to him, remember the Old Testament God who said whatever, blah, 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 and we had the law, and let me tell you who God really is. I forgive infinitely. Okay? Now, I'm not telling you to just forgive infinitely. And this is very important. I'm telling you that when you're like me, you forgive infinitely. Does everyone see the difference? So it's like when someone has a fever, okay, and the temperature is high. What's the problem? It's not the fever. It's what? The virus, right? We give them antibiotics. Someone has an infection. That's why the fever is high. I don't really care about the fever. I care about the infection. Fix the infection and the fever will go down naturally. Make sense? So we have a problem underneath, right? So chasing the symptoms isn't really going to get me my solution. Maybe I need take some Tylenol to get the fever down in the next 4 hours, but I need antibiotics to fix it. So what Jesus is saying to Peter is not, I need you to forgive, and so every time someone's going, okay, fine, I'll forgive, fine, I'll forgive, fine, I'll forgive. No, then you're not really forgiving. He's saying, this is who I am. This is who I am. And you can use this as a thermometer. Do you forgive? If not, then you're not like me. That's it. It's that simple. Does that make sense? So what's the solution? Don't just try to forgive. Try to be like Christ. Be the image and likeness. Be in the body of Christ. Be Him and Him in you. And when you do that, you will forgive. And you will be humble. And you will be loving. And you won't have to think about it. You just will. Right? You guys know you ever see the, Teta, right? Teta loves everybody, right? And she has this loving heart. And no matter what Teta says, we all love Teta. And it's because she's full of this love. And everything she does comes out with love. And it doesn't really matter what Teta says, right? Teta, you can walk in, and Teta goes, you look fat. And you're like, I love you too, Teta. Because the heart is full of this love, right? And that's the focus. That should be our focus. Not just, what do I need to do? Like Peter's asking, how many times should I forgive him? If you're asking me, then you're not like me. So don't ask me. Be like me. Focus on being like me. So how do we forgive St. John Maximovich? He was actually if you don't know his story, he's a bishop in San Francisco in China. He died recently, like 1950 or something. He's like the equivalent of Pope Kyrillos. I have a book this thick of his miracles. He's just amazing. He says, God's grace always assists a struggler. But this does not mean that a struggler is always in the position of a victor. Now, I want you to hear these words. They're very, very important. I know it's a long night, and you guys all came after work, and I appreciate it. What is important is not the victory or the position of a victor, but rather the labor of striving towards God and devotion to Him. Though a man may be found in a weak state, that does not at all mean that he has been abandoned by God. What's he saying? What's a victor? Someone who wins, not a loser. And so who does God help? He says it in the first sentence, the struggler. What does that mean? That means you're going to try and you're going to fail. And that's okay. What's important is not being a victor. It's not important that you win. It's important that you struggle. And this is something I think that I feel like we don't always have a very clear sense of. We think, I want to be good. Or this guy's a good person. Is anyone good? No. Right? St. Paul says, no one is good, no, not one. So we don't come to church to be good. We don't evaluate people on good or bad. What do we evaluate on? We don't evaluate. What does God evaluate on? Struggle. You have to struggle. Right? And that fight inside, that's everything. Doesn't matter if you forgive or not. It doesn't matter if the person appreciates it or not. It doesn't matter if the person spits on you afterwards or not. I struggled. That's it. God blesses my struggle. So I don't have to achieve anything. So when someone wrongs you, whether it be your spouse or a coworker or a friend or anyone, the fight goes where? Inside. As soon as someone يغلط فيك, where does the fight go? Inside. Now it's me against me. When my wife or my husband wrongs me, where's the fight? It's me against me. Now I struggle. Now it's my battle. I fight to forgive. I fight to love. And God blesses that struggle. You may not win. That doesn't matter. You may win sometimes and lose sometimes. You may lose 20 times and win. Who cares? But you're fighting. And that's where God's blessing is. I have too many slides. Bunam Shoy, Kamil. Hopefully one of these days, Saint Bunam Shoy Kamil. He says, the closer we come to the saints, the closer we come to our Lord Jesus Christ. Likewise, the closer we come to Christ, the closer we come to the saints. What is he saying? Oh, sorry. This thing, okay. He's saying if you want to get close to your spouse, you can go on date night, you can go on movie night, you can go on, let's play games, let's do a romantic getaway, let's go shopping together. No, don't do that. That's not going to go well. You can do all these things. Let's go back to the same place we met. Let's go to the first movie theater we watched. Let's go to the place we went on our honeymoon. Let's rekindle feelings. I'm old enough to tell you it doesn't work. So what's Abuna Shokem saying? Get closer to Christ. Again, where's the struggle? Inside. And if he or she is getting closer to Christ, and I'm getting closer to Christ, what happens? We get closer to each other. And the saints draw out like these circles, right? And all these people are on the circle, and we're all running around. And God's in the middle. And if we're all just going to the middle, thank you. If we're all just going to the middle, without thinking, without trying, without, romantic getaways, I'm not saying you shouldn't have romantic getaways, I'm just saying, all of a sudden, I look, my wife's right next to me. My husband's right next to me. I wasn't even paying attention. I was just focused on Christ. And so is he, and so is she. And so these concentric circles are a very important concept, right? And as we get older, right, and the emotional part of marriage starts to fade, right? And the feelings and right, all that stuff starts to fade. Right? This stuff, then we start to move closer and we just start focusing on Christ. And slowly, I look again and there she is. And we're closer than we've ever been. Not emotionally, not because we have all these feelings, but because now we're both right next to God. So who's the real enemy? This is important, especially when you're fighting. He says, the devil cunningly induces us, instead of irritating us against himself, to notice our neighbor's sin. You can remove the word neighbor and put husband or wife. To make us spiteful and angry with each other, and to awaken our contempt towards them, thus keeping us in enmity with our neighbors and the Lord God himself. Therefore, we must despise the sins, the faults themselves, and not our brother who commits them at the devil's instigation. Through infirmity and habit, we must pity him and gently and lovingly instruct him as one who forgets himself, who is sick as a prisoner and the slave of his sin. But our animosity, our anger toward the sinner, only increases his sickness, oblivion, and spiritual bondage instead of lessening them. I'm going to talk more about this another time. But this is a very important concept, and I'm going to beat it several times in many of these talks. The enemy is not your husband or your wife or your kids. The enemy is Satan. And we have to be very focused. St. Paul says, we do not fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities, dominions, and all powers of the evil one. Our enemy is not the other person. The other person is the image and likeness of God. They are our flesh. They're not the enemy. The enemy is the devil. And so when we take our eyes off the devil and we look at the person, then we have a problem. Right? Because now we think It says here, we have contempt toward them, and it keeps us away from God. So he says, we must pity him, gently and lovingly instruct him as one who forgets himself or who is sick as a prisoner and slave of his sin. So I want you to think of an image, right? When your child has the flu, and he's in bed, and he's sick, and he's like, Mom, I need water. Mom, I need you to give me a blanket. Mom, I need Gatorade. Mom, I need Dad. I need to turn up the heat. Dad, turn down the heat. Dad, I'm cold. Dad, I'm hot. What do you say? What do you say to your kid? Do you say, what's wrong with you? You just asked to raise the temperature, and now you want to drop the temperature. You just asked for a blanket, and now you threw it on the ground. You want soup again? You just had soup. Why do you keep bothering me? Is that what we say? You'd be an animal to say that, right? You wouldn't be a human. What do you say? You say, oh, Habibi, what else do you need? What can I get you? What kind of Gatorade do you like? Is the water too cold? Is the water too hot? Do you need anything, Habibi? Do you want me to turn on the TV? Do you want to sleep? Do you want me to talk? Do you want me to read you a book? Right? Why? Because they're sick. Did you get that? And so when someone is sick, what do? I do more for them because they're sick physically. So what happens if someone is sick spiritually? Because there are people who are sick spiritually, aren't there? Ugly people who do ugly things, like me. And when I see them, do I go, you're so ugly? You know what she said? You know what he does? Do you know what they do? Do you know how they talk? Is that what you say? Or do you say, Habibi, how can I help? What can I get you? Do you want to get some coffee? Let's talk. Do you need something? When someone screams at me, yells at me, how do I react? Don't I have to think to myself, why is he screaming? What's wrong? What's going on? You know, when my kids were little, they'd come home and they say, the bully is picking on me at school. He pushes me, he does blah, 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 he does blah, blah, blah. Do you know what I told my kids? I said, that bully, his dad is mean to him. And he doesn't have any love. He needs more attention and more love than anyone else in the school. And what does the school do? It punishes him. It says, you go stand outside. In fact, he needs the opposite. He needs a friend. In fact, when a bully pushes another kid, he's often saying, can you be my friend? That's how bullies talk, because that's how their dad talks to them at home. And so sometimes you have to see past the reaction, right? When a woman's coming at you and she's screaming and you're this and you're that, Habibti, what's wrong at home? I think my husband doesn't love me. Ah, okay, now I get it. Now I see why you're screaming. Now I see why you're judging. Now I see why you're gossiping. Now I see why you have hatred. Right? The enemy isn't her. The enemy is Satan. That make sense? I think this is too long. Okay, I'll end. You should all be asleep by now. I'm on a different time zone, so I'm wide awake. I'm 3 hours ahead of you, so I'm behind you. So in summary, Jesus Christ forgave me. I am in the image of Christ, and I want to be like him, then I will forgive in the same way. And when I don't, that means there's something wrong with the image. Loving one's enemies does not mean loving wickedness, theft, ungodliness, or adultery. Rather, it means loving the thief, the ungodly person, the adulterer, not as far as he sins, but as he is a man and is the work of God. St. Clement of Alexandria. I don't know what's next, but does anybody have any? Glory be to God forever, amen. I don't know what you guys are. You're good. I think it's on.